Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. If I sound a bit muffled, don't play around with your settings. It's me. I've picked up a slight cold. I'm back from Brazil and slightly depressed because on Sunday morning I tuned into Insiders, as we in the Canberra bubble do, because the feature interview was with Richard Marles, and unfortunately I learnt very little about anything going on within defence, and now that's partly because he insists on using the title of Deputy Prime Minister rather than Defence Minister. Personally, I've always thought that there's something wrong with people who insist on titles because I think it shows a very high level of personal insecurity. But by doing that, he's able to deflect questions from defence-specific issues to more sort of whole-of-government stuff. And that's the way that it played out, with him getting questions about Julian Assange and a senator crossing the floor, and a completely wasted one about Joe Biden's debate performance. By the way, a tip for all journalists: never ever waste time asking for Australian politicians to comment on US domestic matters. It's not going to happen. Save your question for something useful. Yes, I'm back from Brazil, but I've by no means given up on the main theme of that visit, which was to look at the C-390 transport aircraft, the main theme of my previous podcast. Now, I've got a bit more to say about that. I gave people an overview that it looks that the C-390 for a number of customers is a better fit than the C-130J, and it's to my great annoyance and frustration that it was not considered for the Australian requirement. Now, I've got a bit more evidence in the form of the Dutch evaluation process, selection process, and they issued something called a B letter. The Dutch process is very formal. The A letter, which goes out to the public, sort of defines the requirement. The B letter explains the selection and the evaluation process. Now, the Dutch need for tactical air transport changed following a couple of events: the evacuation of Kabul and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the Netherlands concluded that their requirement had increased from 2,400 hours per year to 4,000 hours per year, leading to a detailed evaluation of two designs, the C-390 from Embraer and the C-130J. Now, the Netherlands is highly regarded as an evaluator. It's a thorough and very knowledgeable customer. Their defence science organisation, the TNO, I've no idea what the acronym stands for in Dutch, but it's the equivalent of our DSTG, is absolutely world-class. Now, I'm going to quote directly from the evaluation. As I say, this is a publicly available document that presumably no one in the RAF or Defence bothered looking at. It says, two potentially suitable candidates emerged from this initial selection, the C-130J from the US manufacturer Lockheed Martin and the C-390M from the Brazilian manufacturer Embraer. These two candidates must comply with military aviation requirements and were compared with each other during the research phase. The research phase revealed that the C-390M is the only candidate within the target budget that can meet the requirements within the framework of commercial/military off-the-shelf COTS/MOTS. This candidate meets almost all requirements and can be delivered and certified within the set timeframe. Compared to the C-130J, the C-390M has a higher availability and needs considerably less maintenance. This means that more hours can be flown with the same number of aircraft. A number of elements in this research phase are further explained below. The C-390M has a multi-mission concept whereby the required mission types are incorporated in a standard configuration. The C-390M scores higher than the C-130J on a number of operational and technical requirements and meets operational needs. The C-130J can meet the Dutch operational requirement, but must be equipped with various mission-specific elements that are not available in the COTS-MOTS configuration we require. I'm continuing to quote from the official report. The C-390M requires less maintenance and can provide more effective flight hours per aircraft than the C-130J. Based on the information obtained in the B phase, the C-390M can meet the minimum requirement of 2,400 flight hours with 4 aircraft. With 5 aircraft, 4,000 can be flown. On the other hand, based on the information obtained in the research phase, the type C-130J already requires at least 5 aircraft for 2,400 flight hours. For the C-130, 5 aircraft are not sufficient to meet the requirement of 4,000 hours. Now, my words, this presumably means that at least 6 C-130Js are required to do the same work as 4 C-390s. I mean, this is really devastating stuff. It continues. The C-390 is, besides a tactical deployable aircraft, also more suitable to be used for strategic movements than the C-130J. The C-390M can, with the increase of the need in the number of hours, also meet part of the national need for guaranteed available strategic transport capacity. The estimated life cycle costs of the C-390 are within the allocated budget. On the other hand, the estimated life cycle costs of the C-130J do not fit. Now, there's a lot more of this, but surely that's enough to make the point that the C-390 is in many respects a better aircraft than the C-130J. It can go further, it can fly faster, it can carry more cargo. That report, by the way, was signed off by the Dutch Secretary of State. So it's not an article by a journalist being critical. This is the official Dutch evaluation there in black and white. Now, as I also mentioned last time, the South Korean Defense Acquisition Program Administration, DARPA, came to exactly the same conclusion, that the C-390 is better value than the C-130J. And that's something of a surprise given the extremely close relationship between the US and the Republic of Korea. And the effectiveness of DARPA helps explain why South Korea has been able to develop systems such as the KF-21 supersonic combat aircraft, the K-2 main battle tank, and 11,000-ton KDX destroyers with 128 vertical launch cells. The comparison with Australia's feeble acquisition efforts could not be more stark. So you also had the South Koreans, with all of their intellectual horsepower, all of their experience, and all of their pressing operational needs, because of the ongoing threat from the north, coming to the same conclusion as the Dutch. Again, that the C-390 is the aircraft for them. Now, let's get back to the RAF. Rather than doing even the most cursory evaluation, they have just sprayed $10 billion at buying more C-130Js. If they had bothered looking, they would have almost certainly discovered that rather than needing the original 24 they said they wanted, as I said in the last podcast, this number was mysteriously reduced to 20 with a $300 million price increase, they would have been able to get away with a smaller number of C-390s, maybe 18 of them, maybe 16, who knows? The point is they didn't bother looking. If they had done the maths and calculated that a smaller number of C-390s would have met the requirements, This would have saved a couple of $1 billion in acquisition costs and, just as importantly, enormous through-life savings, many billions of dollars over the life of the aircraft, because you have fewer aircraft to support, fewer spares, less people to train, fewer air crew, all of those sorts of things. But no, instead, this fire hose of cash is just poured straight into the US FMS system, demonstrating, once again, total contempt for the Australian taxpayer. And as an aside, the Royal Air Force, this is in the UK, which operates both the A400M and the C-130Js, they are retiring, or have retired, their C-130Js early because they are no longer cost-effective. But what does Australia do? The so-called desktop study concluding we're going to replace old C-130Js with $10 billion worth of newer C-130Js. Now, I also said in the last podcast that I was going to have a few words to say about Embraer and their very impressive corporate culture and their approach to aircraft manufacturing, which places a premium on safety. This is both for civil and military production lines, and it includes features such as any worker can stop the line if they have a concern. In fact, workers are encouraged to do so. And I've got a whole lot of anecdotes, but again, with an eye on the clock, I'll just tell one. And this is the C390 production line, and that apparently a guy on the production line thought sometime after the event, several days after the event, that he should have stopped production of the aircraft because he wasn't 100% certain about something that had occurred. Now, this had bothered him, and he came back several days later and sort of fessed up to the supervisors, said, look, I should have done something about it at the time, but I didn't. Guess what happened? They identified the aircraft, they took it out of the production process, and basically they dismantled the entire aircraft. It was a process that took them 3 months, and they thoroughly checked every single aspect to find out or to satisfy themselves that there was absolutely nothing wrong. Now, it's that sort of extreme emphasis on safety that not only produces safe aircraft, it also means that they are extremely reliable. So I'd encourage anyone who really wants to understand how a good corporate culture works in terms of safety to have a look at Embraer and to use them as a role model. Now, the other big thing, and this gives me no pleasure, the absolute disaster of this general-purpose frigate program, C3000, matched with the exceptionally poor job done originally by the Naval Surface Fleet Independent Review Team. I've touched on this before. The original report attempted to, well, they did list 4 designs, but as I've repeatedly pointed out, there are actually 5 or maybe even 6 designs, and 3 of those are from South Korea. In fact, the only named design from Korea, the Daewoo class, is in fact the one least likely to be considered. It probably shouldn't have been on the shortlist in the first place, nor should the Spanish Alpha 3000 have been there, which I've also touched on because it's just too small. Now, regarding the program, Deputy Secretary Jim McDowell, this is June 5th Senate estimates. I've read all of it so that you don't have to. And this is a quote. He said, "The trade-off is one that is made, that is, the first criteria is to get minimum viable capability into service as quickly as possible. Therefore, one of the trades that you might make for that is exotic capability that would have to be retrofitted to an already established design, which, as we know, is the basic criterion for those 4 ships, the 4 exemplar ships, which were recommended by the independent review." This is my comment, and as mentioned above, the review couldn't even get the 4 exemplar ships right. Anyway, he continues, "The first criteria is speed to minimum viable capability. Therefore, you will have no design changes. Therefore, you'll get your capability there or here. It will not be an objective capability, perhaps, but it will be a minimum viable capability, and it will get there many years sooner than if we have to retrofit the design of a CEA radar. Look, it's difficult for me to overstate just how significant this stuff is and how damaging it is going to be. Over the last 30 years, the combination of Saab with 9LV and CEA radars, we have a powerful sovereign capability in naval radars and naval combat systems here. It's all being thrown away by this minimum viable capability concept, which makes no sense in any case because, as I've said, we are surely not going to take into service, ships with signage in Korean or Arabic or Japanese, and there are a whole lot of Australian naval and maritime laws, rules and regulations, which mean that ships taken straight from an overseas shipyard could not even be registered for use in Australia. Anyway, sorry, I'll continue with a quote from Deputy Secretary McDowell. But there is simply no way that we could design and redesign those exemplar ships to take a C radar or a 9LV and still get them in the water, commissioned in service with the Royal Australian Navy in the timescales that were being recommended by government. Well, hang on, this is me now. I think that is just simply wrong. Anyway, he continues, and yes, you might get a better ship a few years later, but for that period of time, then you're actually worse off because you have no ships in the water, even with a minimum viable capability. Now, how does he or the department possibly know that? Obviously, they're being briefed by people who can't even use Wikipedia. Because, as I've mentioned previously, the bid from Hanwha Ocean is likely to be the ship that they have built from the Royal Thai Navy, which already has 9LV installed. And unless I'm very much mistaken, the Thai ship already has consoles from Adelaide as well as the combat management system itself. And the German design, the MEKO ships have included 9LV. And when it comes to the installation of CEA and the radar mast and things like that, well, I'd like the opinion of Hyundai Heavy Industries on that one because, again, as I've documented in a previous podcast, they can design, build, launch, and go through sea trials an 11,000-ton KDX destroyer in 4 years flat. Now, we've got 5 years until 2029. If they can do an entire KDX destroyer in that 5-year window of opportunity, I have no doubt that they would be able to do a frigate with a fully integrated radar mast with the CA radar suite in less than 5 years, which basically Defence and Navy are already telling the world cannot be done. I'm saying, yes, it can be done. Go and speak to industry. Now, with an eye on the clock, I've just got one final item. The dominant news coming from the United States has been the Trump-Biden debate. Joe Biden's position for re-election has been considerably weakened. That's the consensus. If we project ahead to a Trump presidency, a Trump administration, what his view of AUKUS is likely to be, I believe that the position of Australia has been immeasurably weakened because of the information that we got out of Senate estimates from Vice Admiral Jonathan Meade that there is no refund clause for the $4.6 billion donation that we are making to US defense industry. I mean, what incentive would there be for a Trump administration to go ahead with this deal when they say, well, what happens if we don't transfer second-hand Virginia-class submarines to Australia? And US officials say, well, the Australians will be very disappointed. Yeah, and? Do they want their money back? No, Mr. President, there are no strings attached. They've given it to us. I mean, why do we keep on doing this? Now, speaking of money being sprayed around, you might see the occasional drip feed of announcements coming from Defence. 3 Australian junior officers are graduating from a submarine course. We are paying for that. US $2 billion to be precise, which is $3 billion Australian. it's an FMS deal. So even these little training exercises, it's the Australian taxpayer that is forking out for all of that. Okay, that's all I've got time for today. Thank you very much for listening. See you next time, and goodbye for now.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.